retired after 30 years as a union and community organizer in Oregon and California, and moved with his wife Carol to Ajijic in 2007. Since coming here, he and Carol have visited many of Mexico's colonial cities and ancient ruins. They have chronicled their journeys in their blog, Jim and Carol's Mexico Adventure. This is what's amazing. Since 2007, the blog has attracted more than 1 million visitors from over 130 countries on every continent in the world, including Antarctica. A documentary film company is going to use his photos of ancient Toltec ruins on a feature to be aired on the History Channel. Please welcome Jim Cook.
Good morning. That was terrible. Good morning. All right, much better. I'm glad to see that people aren't totally asleep, as I almost was this morning. The fellow that helped set this up was saying he has a recurrent fear that the speaker is going to sleep in. Well, there's my talk. Thank you for coming today. And as my introducer said, I'm going to talk about Santiago Matamoros, whose feast day is tomorrow. As a matter of fact, some of you may have seen in one of the previous WAD reporters a little article that says it's fiesta time in Ixtlahuacan. You know, that's a little town that's right over the mountain from Chapala. And tomorrow is the feast day. The Patronal has been going on for several days, but tomorrow is the evening is the end of it. So if you happen to get over there, you might want to stop in and see how the locals, at least in that area, celebrate it. And I'm hoping that today I'll give you a little background so that if you do run across one of these fiestas as you're staying in Mexico, or if you visit a Mexican church, particularly some of the old 16th and 17th century chapels, and see a representation of Santiago Matamoros, you'll know what it's all about. Over 2,000 years since his death, legends about Santiago have been used both to fight oppression and as a means of conquest. In English, Santiago is called St. James. The story I'm going to tell is how St. James the Apostle became St. James the Moor Slayer, and later St. James the Indian Killer. Legends about Santiago have come from a wide variety of sources, but he first appears in the New Testament as James the son of Zebedee. According to the biblical story, James and his brother John were fishermen living along the Sea of Galilee in Roman-occupied Palestine. They were among the first men chosen by Jesus to become members of his 12 apostles. James the Apostle is called Santiago Apostol in Spanish. This was how he was known for the first 1,200 years of Christian history. In the Bible, Jesus gave James and his brother the nickname Sons of Thunder because of their outspoken ways and fiery tempers. At one point, Jesus even rebuked James for asking that heavenly fire be rained down upon a town that had been unfriendly to the apostles. I don't even need to bring tomatoes. So at one point he rebuked them for asking for heavenly fire. Oh God, how could he get some myself? Several years after Jesus' execution, the Bible says James was martyred by King Herod of Judea, had his head cut off with a sword. And he was the first apostle to be martyred, and the only one whose martyrdom is mentioned in the Bible. Although there are a few other biblical references about James, this is pretty much what the New Testament tells about James the Apostle. So what was James's connection with Spain, or Iberia, as the Romans called it? I should note that most biblical scholars dispute that James ever went to Spain. However, we're dealing with lessons here, and who wants to get in the way of a good story? One practical question is worth asking: was it likely or even possible for James to have traveled all that way from his home in Palestine to Iberia? After all, that's a distance of 4,015 kilometers. I looked it up. Or about 2,500 miles. The answer is yes. Iberia was an integral part of the Roman Empire at the time and had been so for several centuries. It was settled and highly civilized. The Mediterranean was the hub of the empire's transportation and communication network. Traveling by sea from Palestine to Iberia did carry some risk of storms and shipwreck. However, by that time, the Romans had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and hostile navies. As long-distance travel goes in that era, it wasn't that big a deal. Merchants and Roman officials did it all the time. So it is certainly possible that James visited Spain. However, all we have to go on are legends. One of the most famous of these legends tells of an encounter between James and the Virgin Mary. According to this story, he met her in 40 AD, and while she was standing on a pillar on the banks of the Ebro River. That's a river that's in northern Spain. The pillar is still preserved today as a holy relic in the Spanish city of Zaragoza. One problem of the story of James in Spain is that the Bible says he was martyred in Palestine. Several of the legends attempt to reconcile how his body ended up in Spain after his martyrdom. In general, the legends claim that James returned to Judea from Iberia shortly before he was executed by Herod. Because James had founded the Iberian church, his body was supposedly returned there by sea. According to one of these legends, the ship was wrecked in a storm off the Spanish coast. This would have been the northwest coast of Spain, the Atlantic coast. And his body washed overboard. It was later recovered on the shore. Miraculously, it was intact. The legend doesn't say whether the head was still there, but it was intact. And it was covered with scallop shells. The various legends agree that James's body was buried near the northwest coast of Iberia. And over the centuries, the scallop shell has come to symbolize both James and the famous pilgrimage to his gravesite at Santiago de Compostela. The lines on a scallop shell, if you think of a scallop shell, it's shaped kind of like this, right? This is the outer edge of it. And the lines all converge to a central point at the base. Now, supposedly, these lines represent the different routes that the pilgrims took from all over Europe to reach Santiago de Compostela, and Santiago de Compostela is the place where those lines converge. Many pilgrims still carry and even wear scallops during their journey on the pilgrimage. And in Mexico, you can find scallop shell decorations in many colonial-era churches. If you look around, you'll see them everywhere. So how did James come to be called Santiago by the Spanish? The name James, of course, is the English version of his Hebrew name. However, the Iberians didn't speak English, so they translated the Hebrew as Iago, I-A-G-O. Thus, when the church declared Iago to be a saint, he became Santiago. Learn something new every day. Christianity struggled to survive for its first 3 centuries. Eventually, the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized it and made it the official religion of the empire. For the next 400 years, the Iberian church flourished. They even managed to convert the Visigoths, who were the Germanic barbarians who overran Spain when the empire collapsed. However, in 711 AD, an army of North African Muslims crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and landed on the south coast of Spain. The North Africans called themselves Berbers, but the Spanish called them Moors. Within 7 years, the Moors had seized nearly all of Iberia, completely crushing the Visigoth kingdom. The long effort by the Christians to expel the Moors from Spain is called the Reconquest, or in Spanish, La Reconquista. This struggle deeply affected the Spanish national character and resulted in a Christian religious fanaticism that carried over into the 20th century. The experience of La Reconquista also impacted how the Spanish treated those they conquered in the New World. At first, the Moors were triumphant. At the end of 7 years, only a handful of small Christian principalities held out on the north coast of Iberia. The Moors even crossed the Pyrenees to invade southern France, but they were defeated in a great battle. Anybody ever hear of the Song of Roland, historically? Right, this was part of that battle where they were turned back. After that, the Moors pretty much settled down to enjoy their new possessions in Spain. Over the next several centuries, they created a glittering civilization. In architecture, city planning, medicine, and technology, they far exceeded anything else that was in Christian Europe at that time. La Reconquista began in 718 AD, basically 7 years after the Moors landed. A Visigoth warlord finally managed to defeat a Moorish army at Covadonga in the Pyrenees Mountains. He established the Kingdom of Asturias, which was to become famous in medieval Spanish history. From this point, La Reconquista was a long, slow process that moved in fits and starts. At first, the struggle was not really about religion. It was about territory. Christians and Moors sometimes became allies against other groups of Christians and Moors. Cities and provinces changed hands back and forth. The story, believe me, is interminable, right? However, gradually Christian enclaves in Spain expanded and the Moorish-controlled area gradually contracted. In 813 AD, about 100 years after the Moors first landed, a Christian hermit in northwest Spain was clearing weeds, and he stumbled across what he believed to be the burial site of Santiago Apostol. Once again, this would have been in the northwest part of Spain. The hermit reported his discovery to King Alfonso II, the Christian king of the region. The king immediately understood the political and military significance of the hermit's story. Whether it was true or not, it was still good news. Alfonso promptly announced that the grave was real and that Santiago Apostol was therefore the patron of his kingdom. This was a shrewd move. It made his kingdom a very important place for Christians to defend. King Alfonso renamed the area around the grave Campus Stellae, which is Latin for Field of Stars. Over time, this became Compostela. Legends about Santiago began to pop up everywhere, and pilgrims began to visit the gravesite. Gradually, a town grew up around it called Santiago Compostela. About 50 years later, in 859 AD, the Christians of Asturias won a crushing victory over the army of a local Moorish lord in the Battle of Monte la Turce. Although the Moors lost the battle, it didn't actually change much. In fact, typically, the Christian king was the nephew of the Muslim lord he defeated. There was a lot of intermarriage going on. The battle was just another of the interminable small-scale territorial conflicts without any particular military or religious significance at the time. The real significance of this event would not be revealed for another 300 years. Then, in the 12th century, the Battle of Monte la Turce was used as a model to create another wholly fictitious battle called the Battle of Clavijo. This was the battle where Santiago got his famous nickname, Moor Slayer. The bogus Battle of Clavijo and Santiago's role in it would rally Christians to victory in the later stages of La Reconquista. Still later, Santiago would be invoked during the battles between Spanish conquistadors and the indigenous warriors of the New World. So, who invented this battle? And why did it become so important for Spaniards to believe that it was real? The first mention of the Battle of Clavijo appears in a 12th century document written by a cleric named Pedro Marcio. He was a canon, which is a clerical official, in the Cathedral of Santiago Compostela. Surprise. The cleric claimed that he had copied the document from an older one, dating to the middle of the 9th century. What he described bears a striking resemblance to the real Battle of La Terce, which had been fought 300 years before, but was only dimly remembered at that time. Pedro Marcio's document alleged that the king who had won the fictitious Battle of Clavijo had pledged a series of donations to the Cathedral of Santiago Compostela to thank the saint for his help in the victory. Bottom line, this was a simple forgery invented to justify an economic claim. Not at all an unusual sort of situation in the Middle Ages. Happened all the time. Ordinarily, Pedro Marcio's document would have remained unnoticed in some dusty church archive. However, it was written in the 12th century. And then, dramatic events were occurring. You will remember that if you remember your history, you will remember that the First Crusade was declared in 1095. That's right at the end of the 11th century. And during the 12th century, and then it was fought shortly after that. And in the 12th century, there were two more great crusades. So this was a time of great Christian fervor and uprising of feeling that we have to drive the Muslims out of the Holy Land and drive them back. So this was the context in which Pedro Marcio wrote his document, and it became public. Well, the result was the story spread like wildfire. And the struggle between in Spain between the Christian and Muslim princes began to take on a different character. People started to view these conflicts as part of a great crusade, rather than an endless series of small, meaningless territorial squabbles. So what was the story that Pedro Marcio concocted about Clavijo, and what role does Santiago play in it? Well, supposedly the battle was fought in 834 AD, although later on they changed the date so it would fit better. They were also prone to do that sort of thing in the Middle Ages. It was fought during a war between the Christian king Ramiro I of Asturias and the Muslims under the Emir of Cordoba. To juice up the story, the author invented a very inflammatory claim about what the cause of the war was. He wrote that for a century before the battle, the Muslim rulers had demanded an annual tribute of 100 female Christian virgins, half noble and half commoners. According to the story, previous Christian rulers had annually delivered the required number of nubile young girls to the emir's harem. Obviously, this stirred things up somewhat. However, King Ramiro supposedly repudiated this tribute, and it set off the war. The vastly superior Moorish army initially drove the Christians back into a nearby castle. That evening, the king and his knights were exhausted and discouraged. Their prospects looked bleak. They didn't look forward to the next day. However, during the night, King Ramiro had a vision of Santiago Apostol. The saint came and pledged that if the king led his forces into the battle the next day,
donations. We would love your money as much as you're willing to give.
their war cry. Suddenly, a great knight appeared, riding on a huge, pure white horse. The The document claimed that he struck the field like a ray of light, slashing through the Moors like a scythe. The emir's forces fled for their lives. Santiago Apostol, the follower of the peaceful Jesus, had now become Santiago Matamoros, slayer of Christ's enemies. This was great propaganda. Although that was not what Pedro Marcio had originally intended. He was just trying to secure the bucks for the church. Christian leaders immediately used the story to bolster support for their endless territorial wars. They could now look upon themselves as heroic crusaders, rather than just greedy thugs lusting after somebody else's property. Once again, miraculous stories about the saint began to pop up like mushrooms. Bishop Diego Gelmírez of Santiago Compostela Cathedral rushed to unearth every story he could find about the saint. The result was his History of Santiago, an officially sanctioned compilation of these legends, including the Battle of Clavijo. The bishop's history became a 12th century bestseller. Pilgrims flocked to Santiago Compostela. Still another result was the Spanish Order of Santiago, founded in 1171. These were military monks, similar to the Knights of Templar in Jerusalem. Their function was to protect the pilgrims on the road to Santiago Compostela and to pursue a Spanish crusade. Soon, faithful Spaniards began to donate money and rich properties to the order, which became quite wealthy as a result. Over the next 300 years, La Reconquista became an intensely religious struggle, and its tempo increased. The battle cry, "Strike for Santiago," rang across the Spanish countryside. By the mid-13th century, the Moors had been pushed out of Spain's central highlands into a narrow strip along the southern and Mediterranean coasts. As the Christian-controlled areas expanded, they consolidated into fewer and fewer kingdoms. In the early days, there was just all these tiny little princes. Now, the two largest and most powerful were Castile and Aragon. Together they faced Granada, the single remaining Moorish enclave. Granada managed to hold out for another century, largely because of its mountainous area and its close proximity to Muslim North Africa, and finally the religious fervor of the Moors, who really wanted to hang on to that final enclave that they had in Spain. However, the strength of the Christians continued to grow, along with their religious fanaticism. The end was inevitable, and it finally arrived in 1492, when the Emir of Granada finally surrendered the keys of the city. He was the last of the Muslim rulers on the Iberian Peninsula. The Christian rulers who accepted those keys, wait for it, were King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile. I believe we've heard of them before. Their marriage in 1469 created a Christian kingdom larger than any seen in Iberia since the Moors defeated the Visigoths. Their conquest of Granada established the boundaries of modern Spain, with minor exceptions. Ferdinand and Isabella were dubbed the Catholic monarchs, and they accepted that role with a vengeance. Of the two, Isabella was the more pious or the more fanatical, depending upon your point of view. As soon as Granada fell, they ordered the expulsion of all Muslims and Jews from their realm, although some were allowed to stay if they converted. Those suspected of secretly practicing Islam or Judaism were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and sometimes executed. The Spanish Inquisition was given full powers to enforce mandatory Catholicism. It continued to do so for more than 300 years. The long, bloody Reconquista had finally ended. Santiago Matamoros, the Moor slayer, had become the patron saint of Spain. It is probably worth pondering what St. James, or Jesus himself, might have thought about all this. However, that's not the end of the story. Does anyone here recall another significant event that occurred in 1492? It reads your history. During the final months of the siege of Granada, a man called Christopher Columbus waited impatiently in the Christian camp outside the Moorish city walls. Ferdinand and Isabella would not agree to finance his voyage of discovery until Granada had surrendered. Only a few months after the keys were exchanged, Columbus set off. Even after 4 voyages, Columbus never realized that he had discovered an entirely new world rather than the East Indies he'd been seeking. He should not be faulted for this. After all, the modern equivalent of his discovery would be to suddenly find huge civilizations of unknown people living at the bottom of the ocean. The Spanish, as well as the rest of Europe, had a difficult time figuring out what it all meant. Well, when you aren't sure what to do, you go with what you know. Santiago Matamoros may have thought he could retire at the end of La Reconquista, but he was wrong. He would now be drafted into a whole new field of endeavor. Ultimately, he would be transformed in a way that Pedro Marcio could never have imagined when he faked that document back in the 12th century. In a way, Columbus' discovery of the New World couldn't have happened at a better time for Ferdinand and Isabella and their newly unified kingdom. First, unimaginable wealth began pouring in to Spain after the Aztecs and Incas were conquered. After the expense of that long campaign to conquer Granada, that must have been welcome. Second, Spain's royal couple now had a place to send all those ambitious, battle-hardened soldiers. A place very far away. The presence of large numbers of demobilized soldiers can be very dangerous, especially when they're looking for some way to employ their fighting skills. The conquest of the New World fit the bill perfectly. The conquistadors went with what they knew. They had a ready-made saint to help them fight heathen warriors. Over the next couple of centuries, Santiago Matamoros would miraculously appear 14 times in these New World conflicts. Soon, Santiago Matamoros was being called Mata Indios, or the Indian Killer. In 1531, Spanish soldiers faced off against Otomi warriors near the present-day city of Querétaro. The Otomis were about to overwhelm the Spaniards when Santiago appeared on his famous white horse, causing the Otomi to panic and surrender. A more benign version of this story claims that the Otomis and the Spaniards agreed to fight the battle unarmed. That's when you know you're talking about a legend. When the indigenous warriors were about to triumph, Santiago appeared with a shining cross, calling on both sides to end the struggle peacefully. Not long after this battle, the Spanish founded a city in the area named Santiago Querétaro, in honor of the saint's support. Today, Querétaro is one of Mexico's most prosperous cities. Santiago appeared in conflicts as far north as modern-day New Mexico. People of the Acoma Pueblo were peaceful farmers. For defensive purposes, they had built their town on top of a mesa with sheer cliffs on 3 sides. When the Spanish arrived, they were initially welcomed. However, an arrogant conquistador named Juan de Zaldivar later showed up and demanded food for his hungry troops and women for their amusement. The Acoma people adamantly refused. Zaldivar tried to force them, but he fell to his death off a cliff when they resisted. Unfortunately, he was the nephew of the Spanish governor, Juan de Onate. In revenge, the governor attacked the pueblo. With the help of Santiago, Oñate won the fight. Then he went too far. He punished Acoma by massacring 1,000 people. Their survivors either had their feet cut off or were sold into slavery. When reports of this cruel injustice reached the royal officials, Oñate was recalled and stripped of his wealth and titles. In this case, at least, Santiago's support apparently didn't extend beyond the initial battle. The church also used Santiago to further its ends. Newly conquered natives were taught that God, through his representative Santiago, was on the side of the Spanish. Indigenous people who didn't want to be slaughtered or enslaved needed to abandon their traditional religion and adopt the creed of their conquerors. Santiago and Christianity itself became a powerful ideological weapon in establishing the new order. Since most indigenous people were illiterate, the friars and priests used religious art to reinforce their teachings. If you visit some of Mexico's 16th and 17th century chapels, particularly the older ones, you'll find statues and paintings of Santiago, some of which you see here. Often he'll be mounted on his white horse, and often he'll be wielding a sword. And you can see, of course, here's Santiago on his typical white horse, wearing his red outfit with a broad hat. And in this case, he's wearing a helmet similar to those used by the conquistadors, with a halo, of course, and a cross on it. And interestingly, he has a cross in this hand, but he's got a whip in that hand. And that shows the dual nature of Santiago in the Spanish eyes. He also, you could just barely see here, and on this fellow here too, neither of these are on horses, but they are wearing their horses. They've got a little horse head, and this fellow here, when I photographed him, had a horse behind, out this way. So he wasn't riding a horse, but he was wearing one.
Are those trays similar to the shell?
I think they were more intended to be, as here, they were probably more intended to be a halo, indicating his role as the saint. The practice of dancing has always been an integral part of pre-Hispanic culture. Such dances have survived and continued right up to the present day. I'm sure many of you have seen some of these dances. The church encouraged these dances as long as they didn't subvert Catholic doctrine or Spanish rule. And some of the dances that you will see today, there is a covert message which does subvert Spanish rule. The dance of the old men, that was one that's definitely a slam on the Spanish. The famous dance of the Moors and the Spaniards is still performed regularly at parades and plazas throughout Mexico. Often a statue of Santiago Matamoros will be removed from a local church and carried through the streets. And you can see in this photograph, there are indigenous people wearing masks, carrying Santiago here, wielding his sword on a platform. At other times, the dancer may take the role of Santiago Matamoros, as you see in those other places. And I would mention that one final transformation of Santiago. Conquered people will sometimes take the symbols of their oppressors to use for their own purposes. After all, if a symbol is powerful, why not co-opt it? This happened in Peru in the 18th century when indigenous people revolted against Spanish abuses. The rebels carried statues of Santiago in battle, and ironically, they named him Santiago Mata Españoles, the killer of Spaniards. This is a very plastic saint. Another example can be found here in the Guadalajara area. The indigenous people of Tonalá, and that's where this picture is from, hold their dance of the Tostoanes. Anybody here ever attend that? The dance of the Tostoanes? Yes. Each summer to commemorate a battle against the conquistadors. They wear grotesque masks. You really have to see the masks to believe them. They're amazing. They have snakes and blizzards and all kinds of stuff all over them. And they carry a statue of Santiago Matamoros through the streets. The dancers represent the warriors who were slain in the battle, but who've now come back to life, and Santiago is now supporting them. I guess what goes around comes around. Thank you for coming today and listening to my story of Santiago. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much. Any questions? Just raise your hand and a mic will be brought to you and you can stand up and ask your question. Wait. We've got rules. Really important rules.
This is kind of a very broad question, and you can't get into it deeply, but during the years that the Moors did rule Spain, did they make any attempts to wipe out Christians, or did they live together economically and civilly on about the same basis?
It varied, both according to particular Moorish rulers periods. Sometimes they lived together amicably and intermarried. The Moors were, by and large, at least in the first part, far more tolerant than the Christians ever were. They're very tolerant towards the Jews, for example. But there were some Moors that forced conversions and did that sort of thing. But as time went on and the religious character of La Reconquista became more intense, there was a lot more of that going on.
Okay, question over here. You can stand up, please. Thank you.
The parade, is it on?
Yeah, just kind of hold it out straight.
Yeah, the parade starts tomorrow at 4 o'clock in East Lago.
Excellent,
thank
excellent.
you.
4 o'clock.
And
Don't-
it's all of them, the horse, it's mainly horses. The people riding their horses, so it's real interesting parade.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Somebody else, a question? Here in the middle-ish. If you put up your hand again, so you'll for sure know who you are.
Considering all the
Closer, please.
considering all the legends that has to do with this pilgrimage, why do people still do it now? What is the religious significance of it now?
I'm not a religious person, so I'm not sure if we're qualified to answer that. But I think that people take the stories as metaphors for larger truths. And I think that some people genuinely believe the stories. It's mostly biblical scholars and people like me who read stuff like this, who look into the fact of, well, what's really true and what's not. And I think when I said it earlier that, who wants to get in the way of a good story is the way a lot of people relate to it.
And Jim, may I say that a culture cannot exist without myths. If the myths go away, the culture goes away.
That's
So
right.
in order to keep a culture intact, they have to keep the rituals alive.
The story of George Washington throwing the dollar across the Potomac, physically impossible task, by the way. I used to live there. A lot of people still tell the story. Some people even believe it. Why? It's a good story.
Any other questions? Here in the back.
Well, it's not a question, I'm sorry, Kat, but just a comment in response to the question why people still do the pilgrimage today. A couple of books that would really explain that is one by Paulo Coelho and Shirley MacLaine, who both took the tour, and it was, for them it was more a mystical experience just because of the hardship of doing it from France, which is like almost 500 kilometers walking. And so they had some visions along the way that were probably came out of their exhaustion at times. But anyway, it was a more spiritual experience for them.
I read both of those. Thank you. Thank you for that. Any others? If not, thank you, everybody. This was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Please join us next week to learn how to be fit for life. Pick up your coffee cups and dump them. Please bring your own cups if you have we just like you to bring your own cups. That way you don't have to